So let us begin with a prayer. Lord, you've given us human beings the ability to think, to learn, and to change our mind when our own thinking and learning convinces us of a better way, a way the world sometimes calls the common good, the way we in the church call your will. Lead us all as we make that longest journey from the mind to the heart. And may all our thinking and learning be towards the end of doing your will. In the name of Christ we pray.
Amen.
So I've got about, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. And then I don't have a screen share, but I do have about 9 or 10 books that are listed. And we're in the process of really updating and consolidating the Therefore website, which I hope that Tara and I can get to later this week. So I'll put this up there, but if you want a list of these books sooner, please feel free to just email me and I'll send you a copy of it if we get delayed in what we're able to do this week. So on May 25th, 2020, the video of the killing of George Floyd captured the attention of the American people of all ages and races. It heavily impacted Westminster through discussions in our staff, our session, and among leaders and members of the church. These discussions, as you'll recall, occurred in the opening, really 6 weeks of what turned out to be a lengthy pandemic challenge for every sector of society. I experienced these discussions as both intense and respectful, which is the case for most consequential discussions at Westminster, for which I continue to be grateful both to God and to the members of this church. From watching the news and listening to the voices in and around the church and among friends beyond the church, I realized that, like many white Americans, I needed to learn more both about our country's racial history as well as the current state of affairs in our nation. I want to speak tonight primarily as the pastor and head of staff of the church in which most of us here worship. I hope that you can get a glimpse of the people and resources that have gone into my own continuing to quest to speak from the heart of the Christian faith to the heart of hope and heroism that marks the lives of those who have been soldiers and witnesses for change in both our faith and our nation. I studied significant aspects of American history in the prep school that I attended, particularly American intellectual history, and I continued such study in college. When I went to seminary, I decided to focus on what I knew would be the primary work of my life when I graduated, and that was biblical studies and theology. So I put my reading or interest in American history on hold for about a decade. When I spoke to our adult formation class in October this past year on how the Bible was used to justify slavery and hints for a way out, I was at that point speaking from the field that I felt I knew the most about, which is biblical studies. But today's presentation comes from my more limited background in American history. So I am truly more of a fellow seeker with you all in what I am presenting tonight than I am speaking from, as any kind of an expert. My interest in history has been primarily in 19th and 20th century intellectual history of America. While Southern history, Civil War history, Reconstruction, and African American history intersect with intellectual history, they are different specialties, and I simply had not read many historians within those specialties. But 5 or 6 years ago, before the George Floyd murder, I became aware of a younger and more diverse set of Black writers than I had previously known. These included Tanisha Coates, Ibram X. Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones recently, and as well as the diversity consultant of Robin DiAngelo, who was white. Of these, I had read Coates's Between the World and Me, which was written in 2015. And I was moved by his personal account of the death of his friend at the hands of a Prince George's County police officer when Coates was a student at Howard. And I was saddened by his pessimism and troubled about what it could mean for our country. Theological voices with whom I was familiar were two faculty members that I had known at Union Seminary in the 1970s. The late James Cone, from whom I had never taken a course. I did not take a course from Jim Cone when I was there. And Cornell West, from whom I took 2 courses. I have followed their careers over the years, but until recently had not read much of their specific writings. As I accelerated my reading in the summer of 2020, I quickly became aware of a rich and diverse literature within the Black community of scholars and writers. And the focus of my reading, really on 20 and throughout 21, was on particular works of a lot of people, but I'm really lifting up the following as authors of books primarily, who I would say just had the most impact on me or drew.
Stand your door. You see it very well. Can you?
Sound is bad.
You gotta ask me to speak up.
Oh, you need me to speak up?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do my best on that. You got everybody muted now?
Yeah.
Everybody but me anyway. Okay, so yeah, I'll do my best here to speak up more. So anyway, these are, I think, the 9 or 10 books that I've read over the last couple of years, and I've tried to give a very brief description of them and where they fit in the mix. One is James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which was written in 2013, which I read in conjunction with my recent sermon series on the crucifixion. And I found it to be painful and poignant in the parallels between the death of Jesus Christ on the cross and the deaths of over 4,000 victims of lynching in our nation during the last century and a half. Nicole Hannah-Jones's The 1619 Project, which was originally published in the New York Times Magazine in August of 2019 and followed by subsequent publications. It has been an interesting and controversial piece of historical-minded journalism or public history that has probably more than any other writing gotten us to consider how deeply slavery was embedded since the earliest settlement of our country. And it has led to a robust debate about how defining slavery is for American society. Both Hannah-Jones and Coates, as you probably know, joined the Howard University faculty this last summer. Randall Kennedy's Say It Loud on Race, Law, History, and Culture is a collection of essays that he has written over the last 40 years that provide insight into his legal, historical, and constitutional mind, as well as to his independence of thought, which makes this the book, the one with which I have found the most personal resonance. He is a Harvard Law professor. Jesse McCarthy's Who Will Pay Reparations for My Soul, written in 2021, is by a younger literary scholar at Harvard who is thoughtful, soft-spoken, and deeply analytical of philosophy and popular culture in ways that are dense but are helpful to understanding the African-American experience, with some strong influence from European perspectives that have influenced McCarthy. John McWhorter's Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America, which came out in 2021, is a strong polemic against the ways that he sees dissent and varieties of opinion being suppressed in contemporary discussions about race, to the detriment, he asserts, of the independence and agency of Black Americans. McWhorter is a linguistics professor at Columbia. Daryl Michael Scott's The Scandal of 13therism, published in a journal called Liberties in 2021, is an example of a historian's analysis of a contemporary movement that blames the final clause of the 13th Amendment, of the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery, for the mass incarceration of Black Americans today. Scott, like McWhorter, is thus a voice willing to critique a strand of Black thought from within. And he teaches, and has for a long time, African-American history at Howard. And then Gary Saul Morrison and Morton Shapiro's Minds Wide Shut, How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us, also written in 2021. This is a book written by two men, one who is a scholar of the humanities and the other an economist who is also the president of Northwestern. Both of them are white. They mount a strong defense of open dialogue and debate on university campuses and elsewhere on all issues in American society, including race. Morrison and Shapiro are also white. In addition, I would commend two older and two younger scholars who I think are worth reading and following, though I need to read more of their work. The two older professors on the list are Barbara Fields of Columbia and Adolph Reed of Penn, both of whom are Black. As longtime leaders of the American left, they call attention to the role of class that is involved in the racial suffering and disparities in our nation. They are joined in this by a younger scholar named Matthew Karp at Princeton, who is white. On the other side of the political spectrum, Thomas Chatterton Williams, who is also a younger Black voice, provides moving accounts of his own coming of age in New Jersey and his current life in Paris. His institutional affiliation, as far as I can tell, is with the American Enterprise Institute. I want to add that of these names that I have given you, only James Cone and Cornel West are theologians. The rest are secular scholars or writers whose religious backgrounds or beliefs I do not know. I also want to say that in the digital world in which we live, it is relatively easy to find articles that these and other authors have written, as well as responses to or critiques of their writings. And it's easy to find background information on them, autobiographical, where they went to school, who they studied under, and whether they are a writer, a journalist, a professor, an activist, or a think tanker. This kind of background can provide a fuller understanding of where someone we are reading is coming from, as well as, in some cases, the background and reputation or the platform in which their writing appears. So that's really all I've got to say about the people that I've been reading. So what have I learned the past year and a half from this hold up in COVID down in my basement reading? I think there's about 5 things I want to summarize. One is that terrific scholarship and excellent writing is abundant for us, including a well-developed and fruitful diversity of opinion among Black intellectuals about race in America. This is scholarship and writing from which white Americans can significantly benefit, and I would expect this tradition to continue and grow. Positive roles have existed and continue to exist for protest, for community and political organizing, as well as for legislation, litigation, and education in bringing about change in our society. While the activities within each of these roles vary greatly, as well as the people who are drawn to them, each has its place in our society. Each has a place at the table, including the kind of intellectual depth that I've tried to give you a glimpse of that's out there in the public domain. A special need, I believe, surrounds criminal justice issues, policing and courts and incarceration, to address for the safety of everyone, white and black, so that
I can't do any better.
can be made in other areas.
I guess it's the way they have it set up.
Go ahead. That's Jack and Carolyn. Can you hear better now?
We can't hear them now.
Yeah, we can't hear you now, but you may need to try to turn your volume up.
Is that the microphone over there?
No, it's hidden. It's on your person. You just don't know it. The mic
No,
is-
we're there.
Okay.
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So let me start over on this point. A special need surrounds criminal justice issues, policing, courts, and incarceration, to address for the safety of everyone, white and black, so that progress can be made in other areas. There is a special wound in what black people have experienced or been denied at the hands of law enforcement historically in our country, which must be healed. What we teach about our national past must be honest, truthful, and factual. We must learn history, and we must learn from history. As some of us saw in Alabama, the history of suffering that has been endured by Black Americans must be faced, confronted, and mourned. The courage of Black Americans and their white supporters is to be celebrated for the change such courage has brought. And it must be emulated for the change that our country still needs. Our history is marked by tears and courage. We can be humbled by the tears and inspired by the courage. Both are evident in our past, and both remain evident in our present. So a parting theological word. We live between Martin Luther King's words that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and Ecclesiastes' more sanguine view that what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. We have great challenges and great opportunities in striving to bend the arc of history towards justice, trusting that that bending reflects the work and will of the God we worship, who still remains active in our world and whose actions are still needed for such bending. I believe that the best way to bend that arc is by honoring all our efforts at protest, at organizing, at legislating, at litigating, at learning. No matter how difficult or distrusted any one of these activities may be in different sets of minds. I pray that with all of this diversity of opinion and methods in our nation, we can, in the spirit of Isaiah 118, come now, let us reason together, even as I realize that reasoning together can sometimes seem unreasonable. Along these lines, I would like to close with words of Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago from her commencement address, which she gave, like everybody else, virtually at Northwestern in 2020. And I'll close with a quote from her. Being engaged doesn't mean screaming the loudest. It doesn't mean issuing a set of demands and then villainizing anyone who doesn't immediately pledge allegiance to your favorite manifesto. The public square should be about robust debate, working to muster the facts and arguments to persuade, building coalitions, finding common ground, and of course, leaning into what you believe. Yes, that's all a part of what makes the continuing, evolving American experiment with democracy great and enduring. Democracy will fail. It will utterly fail if we do not see the humanity of other people. Amen.
Amen.
So, response, questions. The floor is yours. I'm done. Judith. Yeah.
So you mentioned Robin DiAngelo. Could you talk about what you read of hers and what you thought? I
read a little bit. I have listened to 2 full-blown podcasts of hers, and some of the people in doing this talk, I decided to only put down the books I've read, but I'm happy to refer to the podcasts I've heard. I didn't read enough of her to have much of an opinion. And what I had read of her was more or less critical before I listened to the podcast. And I thought she comes across as you know, better than I expected. I really have serious questions about a lot of the diversity training, at least in the way it has come down in the earlier years. And you're probably somebody I ought to talk to about that, because I think you worked in that, or you know, were responsible for that field for a while. But I don't have much further that I can say about her that's intelligent, you know, or based on reading. But thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Jim.
Yeah, thank you for this. I wondered, after you've read this diversity and quite an amazing collection, if you feel more optimistic today than you were before the George Floyd murder. I mean, there's so many things happening that make us despair of this, but you see a lot of possibilities in the books you've read. We have all the concerns about critical race theory and all these things floating around that are confusing and not designed to clarify or to cause discussion. So how do you feel? Better?
I didn't realize we were in the picture.
Oh,
Yeah, Jack and Carolyn, y'all are in the picture, so behave, okay? Everybody's in the picture, or most people are in the picture.
I think they probably got 2 things going, because we can hear them and they are muted.
Yeah.
I think they probably have a phone or something going too.
I don't know. Anyway, Jim, the question I'll repeat is Jim, you know, the academic in the group asked how I feel after all this reading, but it's really, you know, on the question of more optimistic or less optimistic. One of the reasons I like Randy Kennedy's writing is he really addresses that head on. And basically, as someone who was from South Carolina and grew up in DC, he describes himself as having been a racial optimist most of his life, but has been less so. Either, I think, both since George Floyd and just some of the reaction, but I think the last time I heard him do a podcast, he was, well, I'm climbing a little bit further on the optimistic track. I don't know, Jim. I mean, I would not say that my optimism or pessimism is particularly limited to race. I think I'm more concerned. I mean, there are some days I'm optimistic. There are more days that I'm not particularly optimistic. I don't know that I would say my pessimism about our country is permanent. I hope it's not permanent. But I think that the division and the confusion and the inability to find or hear magnified voices that seem to offer, either something reasonable or something hopeful. And I'm not talking about something Pollyannish. I'm talking about something that tries to bring people together. It's just hard to find. And I think a lot of that's centered around race, but it's just centered about the general tone and mood of the country. So I don't know that there's anything that's, I think the thing that's made me most optimistic was, I've got to admit that after the George Floyd killing, I really had to play catch up in terms of just reading and finding what voices were out there. And I am always encouraged by diversity of opinion within a range. I'm not talking about people way on the wacky extreme. I'm talking about people who engage one another. And I do think there's good writing that's come out, and I don't have any reason to think that wouldn't continue. And is very interesting, but it's interesting within what one has to say is a tragedy. I mean, it's not, it's still, I just think it's heavy times. It's hard for me to not have felt heavy about our country for a good number of years. And I wish I didn't, because I'm generally a fairly optimistic person about minor things.
What do you think the impact of classism is on racial inequality?
I think it's real. And it's one of the books I didn't mention because I haven't read it is the book Cast, which I know a lot of people have read. And
that's good.
I've heard her on a podcast too, but again, I had not gone that well. But what I find interesting is it's one of the reasons I spoke about Barbara Fields and Adolph Reed, who were long-term socialists and in America. I mean, they're both in their 70s and have been leaders in that for years. But Barbara Fields is particularly good, and I'm told she's very, by a former student at Columbia, that she's really influential on the faculty at Columbia. But she's just done a really good job of documenting cases and studies of, whites in Ohio and Missouri, and sort of like the people that are struggling who are not Black with police issues, police brutality, and other issues. And one of the things that I remember learning in high school, and I think it's a phenomenal issue, but in the early part of their careers, white populists in America, including, I think it was Bilbo in Mississippi, and George Wallace, had their original aim and their original campaigns were a joining of poor whites, of which there were many in the South, and poor Blacks. And, Wallace lost and has a very famous statement that he made after that election, which I won't repeat, but promising never to lose again on that basis. And those weren't the words he used. And I still think that the ground or the soil is fertile for somebody in a positive way, speaking to sort of the economic flatness or decline, let's just say flatness among so many middle and working class Americans of any color. And if somebody could speak to them in a way that united them in ways that were positive and constructive and could get something done, I think that field is right. And I think, it's the expression of, to be honest, it's the expression of besiegement or grievance that former President Trump was and is so good at speaking to. is one of the reasons I think you get so much white vote and an increasing number of Black and Latino votes. But somebody's got to unite it in a way that works politically. And that's not a new issue in American history. And it's never really been successfully done for very long. But people have tried. I do remember that from American history, 40 years ago, because I did for a while. I took a course at Arkansas in populism. I just remember that about it, that some of the early populists in the rural Midwest and South were tried to bridge that gap. But once they lost from it, it was nobody. That's a long-winded answer. Yes, Dan.
I think this, I always speak off the just off the cuff, so this could be as naive as can be. But the reason I feel at all optimistic is because I don't see at the root of racism greed. And greed is the thing that I have absolutely very little hope of getting
Over your own or others.
I would like to think others, but let's just leave it at that and not get too personal, Larry.
Right.
But I will say that greed is somehow even a little bit working towards this, because you'll see many more advertisements on TV where there is an understanding that we all look a variety of ways and we're all consumers. Mm-hmm. Consequently, it is to the advantage of those that just want to make money to include everyone. So correct. I think there is a little more possibility. And it's also something that can speak to our spirit. And getting along with your neighbor is something that is mutually beneficial. Whereas trying to see eye to eye with somebody who's on a very different financial level, doing different things and so forth, can be a little harder. So that's just my own. I think you're really on to something there. So let me expostulate on that a little Tell bit. Me what I'm thinking.
I kind of want to go back to Jim's question about optimism or pessimism. I do think that optimism in America, from those who come here and from those who originally came here and those who seek to come here now, is really based on the American dream. I mean, the belief that they will have a better life here and that they will have a better life for their kids. And I don't think that's necessarily greed by any stretch of the imagination. But I think that kind of optimism probably still has to be part of a solution. And so that's one part of what I want to say to you. Another part of what I want to say to you is I'm aware that some of the criticism that to me is interesting, this goes back to your question about the role of corporations in America, is, from the right, they're criticized now for being, tools and supportive of the cultural left. Okay. A very good member of this church once told me, who had experience in corporate America and somebody that I really trust, he said, corporations always put the bottom line first. Mm-hmm. And some of the critique of some of D'Angelo and some of the diversity training, frankly, is that it's window dressing. I mean, the corporations now see they've got to be over here, to make money and whatever, keep shareholders happy, not lose customers and all that. Can that be turned into something good? It probably can. Is that greed? I don't know. Just because it's corporations doesn't necessarily mean greed. But I mean, there is an economic motive at the heart of America, which does not have to be evil. Mm-hmm. Okay, which does not have to be dismissed, but it has to be understood and used to everybody's advantage, to where it's not false too. To where it's not false too. I don't know, Jim, am I making sense on that? I mean, I'm way out of my. This is not, the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so. I don't know if that gets your question or not, but anyway, that's. Yes, yeah, keep going.
A different
Y'all have
question.
all come out. We can say as long as we want. So.
If I think about the murder of George Floyd,
Right.
When that occurred, I was president of the Graduate Center in New York City. We had to put out a statement.
Right.
So I pulled some people together and said, what kind of statement will you make? And as we were doing this, I made the flip comment, I was shocked that this happened in Minnesota. I grew up in Minnesota. I just thought it was a much more tolerant, open state. Well, one of the people there, by pure accident, was a scholar who had done research on racism in Minnesota. And what struck me, and has sort of driven me ever since, is I've thought of myself over my life as being concerned about these issues, wanting to be as informed as possible, trying to read the books that we're talking about today. But I didn't know that. And so how easy it is for these things to be hidden from us, because we're living in our own cocoon, we're living our own life, and we just don't cross the street to see that. My hope after the incident of the murder of George Floyd was that we would all as a society become much more interested in doing precisely what you did, read a lot. And I don't know if that's happening or not. I don't really know if we're making a big step forward. I think a lot of us hoped after that horrible thing that we would make a big step forward in our country. So I think we made huge progress in our country over the generations, but there's so far to go.
Yeah.
And are we making progress now, or have we actually fallen back? Are we more now even more concerned about hiding crimes? I mean, some of this stuff in the schools, saying we won't have certain books in the school, seems to be an effort to say we don't want anybody to even know about these things. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on what I said that.
Well, it never goes like this, does it?
Well, no, it's right.
Yeah.
Just a couple of things. I probably what I've learned the most, and I sort of knew this, I didn't really know it, but I do think there are very few Black Americans who have not had fears about policing. And I have, once this happened, I realized what I heard Tim Scott say in person. He thought he'd been profiled 11 times his first 2 years in Washington. And there's a woman I know from the Faith and Politics Board who said that, she grew up in Gary, Indiana, but they always came to Mississippi every summer. And her father knew what restaurants along the way were safe to stop at. And this would have been in the 70s. I mean, she's younger than I am. This would have been in the late 60s and 70s. And like the kids would be in the back. Oh, we want to go to that McDonald's. No, we can't stop at that McDonald's, but we can stop over here at this time. I mean, those are things that I, had heard in the past. And you sort of start putting them together with what Donald Gordon had shared with us and others. So I think, and the other part of that's ironic, and why I added the phrase, what police don't do, is this same woman said that her grandmother in Mississippi always kept a loaded gun in the house. And at one point she asked her, Granny, why do you have that loaded gun? I don't know if she asked her as an adult or when, but Granny said, because if we call the sheriff, they won't come. And I hate to pick on Mississippi because it could have been Minnesota.
Right.
I mean, but I think those kind of stories were things that, that are true. and deeply ingrained in the Black experience in America. And that's one reason that I said I think policing has to be addressed. You know, I also have said before that I know a person who happened to be, you know, mayor of a major city in America, and this person said it is one of the hardest reforms to make because of just the power. I mean, when you've got the police, deputy sheriffs, court officials, judges, prosecutors, court-appointed defense attorneys, and the power of the unions. I mean, it's sort of like colleagues. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, we always complain about doctors don't police themselves. You know, I mean, it's just hard to get, whether it's 2% rotten eggs or 5% rotten eggs or 15% rotten eggs or 50% of a corrupt system. It's very hard to get the changes made to make it better. So, you know, that was helpful but not hopeful. You know, so yeah. Right.
As a visitor to the shore, I try to figure out what is the difference between policing in England and policing in the United States. And we had a chief of police come and speak to our church in Colorado some time ago, and she explained without me asking the question, but she said the policing in the United States is based on military techniques. And in the constabulary of England, it is an assist to the people. And nowhere am I saying policing in England is perfect, but it is a very different attitude. You know, I remember that when my child was young, we found something and I thought, great, I'll show her by example. We took this thing to the police station to turn it in for the person that might come and claim it. And I could see immediately the policeman said, thank you very much. You know, this is mine now. You know, it was shocking. It's so obvious. And that's when you know, there's so many differences between societies, and policing is very different in this country from my experience. And education is very different, and healthcare is very different. And these things all hit the lower population, which is generally Black. And I looked myself, coming to this country, I'm the foreigner and the Blacks own this country. And I'm second to Blacks in a lot of ways. So I really had that attitude right off from the start. So those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, I think that's part of the larger.
Yes.
You've alluded to the larger picture. I happen to be, I was in Florida this weekend because my son got married, which was a very great thing in his life and in my experience. But part of his recovering life from alcoholism has been to be very involved in churches that are predominantly recovery churches, where people in it are really, and it's very, I wouldn't even say it's sociologically mixed. It's really, it's racially mixed, but it's pretty much people that are on the margins. But there was an associate pastor of the church who did not do the wedding, but who was there, who is a, you know, he's Hispanic. I don't know if he was 45 or 55 or 65. I couldn't tell his age, but he's a retired Canadian policeman.
Oh.
And he came down to this church and became active, and then they made him, like everybody with Presbyterians can, they made him an associate pastor. But it was a really interesting conversation with him because his experience of America versus Canada, where he was in Toronto, he was a Toronto policeman, now retired, is that, you know, basically in that country, which I think is probably true of a lot of countries, there is just a much more positive attitude towards government, but government provides sort of soups to nuts service, and the taxes are real high. And this guy knew the difference. I mean, he wasn't arguing one way or the other. But I think, you know, I do think that I mean, this country, I had this reinforced in some historical reading I did before George Floyd, but we really do have a huge tradition of individual rights and states' rights and voluntary associations and do it yourself as an individual and don't involve, the government if you don't have to. And I think part of that becomes from a society that for, the first 200 or 300 years, if you didn't like your neighbor, you just moved west and you got another piece of property.
Yeah.
Right.
And then when you hit California, if you didn't want to go to Hawaii or Alaska, then we had to start dealing with ourselves. And, and we are, I guess we're one of the most gun prone societies, but beneath that is we just got a history of vigilantism.
I really don't.
We just take care of crime ourselves.
I don't accept that because I've spent time in Australia and you talk about a frontier country.
That's true.
Comparing it to the United States. And
we're not a frontier anymore.
I know you're not a frontier, but you've got a very frontier attitude.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's
don't tell me to wear a face mask.
Yeah, and that's what I don't want to.
I'm sorry, I'm getting old.
But where I was aware of it, I lived in Texas for 10 years. My wife lived there for.
Oh, yeah.
You were born there, from there, but I can remember as a youth minister there in the early 80s, just being aware of the thing in Texas it wasn't seatbelts by then. They weren't followed either, but it was motorcycle helmets.
Yeah.
And every male in the state of Texas had 3 motorcycles. And probably 1/2% of a helmet. You just didn't do it. And yet, and you look at it and you say, okay, if you have a wreck,
right,
and if you become disabled, you are going to be in the hospital for the next 60 years, and somebody's going to be paying that.
Yeah. Right.
And it's insurance companies, I guess, and because there's not much public support. It's just we just have this individualism, which you can't fight City Hall. You can't. That's the culture in which we live, and we somehow, at our best, have to figure out how to take that and make it work in a place where no man or no woman is an island. You can't. We got to work together. So yes, Rebecca.
We have a question from someone.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you for noticing that. Who's
Sandy?
Oh, I wrote it in a chat. It's Sandy Calhoun. I'm wondering how much our gun culture in this country might attract certain people to go into police work. And why I'm saying that is that one of my sons lives somewhat near the police firing range in Oberlin, Ohio, which is a fairly peaceful city. But they practice a lot. He said, I can't believe that the police force really needs to go out and shoot every single day. I think they like shooting.
I don't know, Sandy. I don't want to touch that one.
Yeah.
I have police people, friends who are not that way, but I'm just saying maybe some of these bad apples, as you were calling them, are people who are attracted to the job. It's a job that a lot of people wouldn't dare ever do. You're putting yourself on the line. So it's got to be somebody who's pretty, who's not averse to being in a difficult situation.
Yeah. And unfortunately, everybody says this, but I think it's true. The great majority of police are great public servants and honorable people, like military. Yes. And it's, they do every time they step into their car to go to work, their life is at risk. So it's I don't know. I don't know enough about that to give you an intelligent answer. Okay, so.
What are we hoping with the Therefore project? How far do we have a picture that we're hoping to find some way to continue and address, keep going and going and going.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the therefore committee was, when we issued the report last June, the idea was that there were 9 recommendations and they are, they are farmed out to appropriate committees. So it's not just, I mean, therefore committee is not supposed to be the one just doing this work. And we got to decide here, before the end of, the next couple of months, whether to extend it or just to further say that. But it was and is an attempt to address racism in some very specific ways, which there have been. I mean, personnel committees, in terms of hiring practices, and B&G in terms of contracting practices, and a lot of what you've seen has been through the Christian formation like this. But there's, all of those are being worked on in different ways.
Well,
Yes.
in order to have these wonderful dialogues you're talking about, Larry, seems to me that we've got to find ways to diminish the many forms of violence that occur from whatever source they come,
Right.
either through weaponry or violence among people and their inability to dialogue properly. Until we learn how to diminish those things, I think that dialogue is going to be in jeopardy.
Dialogue is going to be what?
In jeopardy.
Yeah.
It's in jeopardy in my own congregation. I mean, it's very hard even with a very diverse congregation to have them sit down and really talk to each other. As friendly and as warm as they are to each other, to get beyond
That.
courtesy to how do you really feel?
Yeah.
It's very hard.
Do you think that's in some way the same way when we have different politics in our church and the way we get along is by not talking about those things? Do you think that is similar?
I do think that's similar, and I think they're afraid of offending each other. They don't want to jeopardize the good relationship they have by being honest about what's really happening in their lives. I have I guess George is about 42, maybe in my church, a very active member, Black American, who has been, stopped for no reason. And he lives in a very good neighborhood, just in his own decent, wonderful neighborhood, father of 2 kids, for nothing. And, I can't imagine if George gets stopped, then who else gets stopped?
Like Skip Gates or whatever up in Harvard.
I think that what I was hearing you talk about and what I was hearing you talk about, this idea of trying to bridge, trying to create bridges, because from my perspective, the country is so deeply polarized. And when Maggie, when you talk about, this person is being stalked for no reason, I mean, we could be here all night long and talk about what we have heard in the experience of Black Americans that is completely foreign to us. Like, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, Eric Holder was racing to get to a movie and he was stopped by cops who thought he was a criminal. And Whitney's mother talked about how she had left work every night and she was stopped by cops. And I think being able to talk to each other and learn more about this and internalize this, what is really, it's really hard to get your head around this because it's so incredibly painful. Just the privilege that we walk around with as white Americans, that this has never happened to me. And So I do think that it is important to find ways of connecting with people who have different experiences, different opinions. I actually tried to do this. Someone that I know has a very different political perspective than my own, that I invited her for coffee because I wanted to hear, wanted to understand, you know, her perspective. And she didn't want to talk about it because she was afraid that it would get, you know, hard. And I really tried to bring her out, and, you know, I asked her questions and I said, you know, where did you hear that? How do you know that? And I didn't challenge her. I just asked her where she got her information. And I left there feeling like, you know, I heard her, but I felt like we were both in our little bubbles. Like there was no way to make connection. That's why I feel so.
Well, you know, there's a place that I think of just understanding and acceptance. We have to learn to be uncomfortable in those, you know, it's okay to be uncomfortable in those situations and allow, you know, whatever occurs without becoming volatile in the same sort of moment. But that's an art. I mean, we need to teach that apparently somehow or another. You know, we used to teach this kind of stuff, you know, in some of these humanity classes in high school. I remember going back and, you know, but it's, you know, how do you really, the adults are really need to be the learners in the room because they have a lot, we have a lot as adults to go forward with and do proper dialogue. But I think being uncomfortable is okay. Yes, and we should allow ourselves to be uncomfortable.
And I think that's one of the reasons why your books and the things you're mentioning and what you brought us here together tonight is so important, because we do need to learn. But what we don't need to do is ask others to teach us. And that is something that we're so comfortable doing, is asking, you know, quizzing someone. Well, what would make you feel more comfortable? Or what would make, you know, that's so horrible to ask people to teach us that way. And so I think reading the books and becoming familiar on our own is extraordinarily important.
Yeah, I'm just, the only thing I'd come back to with that is, you know, I'm lucky I've got time to read. Not
That's true.
Does, and interest to do it.
Well,
I mean,
we count on you too to share.
That's not something everybody gets to do.
Reading,
really.
That's open your
and
eyes.
reading can be an escape, which
Not that kind of reading.
Well, I mean, itself, you know, I still think it's, I don't know, I just like Lori Lightfoot's words at the end. And coming from a person that was elected as a progressive mayor of Chicago after Rahm Emanuel, I mean, she was the far left candidate, or at least the progressive candidate. And I thought that was I just thought those words were pretty good. I mean, you know, it's, I'm always hopeful that, I don't know, I'll end on a story of what makes me hopeful. And I don't, this one's just coming into mind, but about 10 years ago, there was a member of the church who I guess grew up in New England, and whose mother it was somebody in the church whose sister worked for whatever organization there was in Dallas that was pro-LGBT issues and education. And I remember this person was visiting the church, and I said, you probably don't have to rent very big hotel rooms for your meetings, do you? Or, you know, ballrooms for your meetings. I mean, just because Dallas is so, you know, so conservative on that. And the mother of this pair in New England was just adamantly, you know, anti-abortion, anti-gay rights, anti-gay marriage, anti-everything. I mean, and these two sisters were describing their mother as just being this totally unreasonable person, you know, and yet she had a boarder who was gay. And when that person got sick, she was just all over with care and concern. And I think, you know, deep, and we've all heard stories of that. I mean, I really think that getting out of our bubble is when we come to get to know somebody who is what we read about, okay, who is what we've heard about. And, you know, it happens in families more and more as there's intermarriage and interracial, you know, and as people are freer, and you just, you know, when you have personal contact or personal familial contact, I think that's the way that there is hope. That hope comes. It's just slow, and the slowness doesn't hurt us because we're not laboring under it. I mean, we can afford for things to be slow, which is always the tragedy. So. Catherine, you want to say anything? You're always so quiet.
I was gonna. Oh no, I had a question for you, but it was like off track. I was curious about if you've been reading any fiction.
Not much.
I feel like where I get this exposure is like reading Colson Whitehead and reading.
I heard him on a podcast.
Reading, like, you know, that both because it to get context for stories, I read a little bit of history to be able to understand what I'm reading, but also because it is the stories without demanding somebody tell me their story or teach me what I want to know. It's somebody who's there who's giving me that story, right? Like reading something like The Nickel Boys is, you know, Colson Whitehead wrote about that, and that's about, you know, it's not what it's about, but he grew up with this sort of dichotomous understanding of like loving the language of Martin Luther King and loving the language of I'm gonna blank on the name right now, but where his sources came from and what he was inspired by, and that led him to tell this story. And so that's kind of, so I wondered if that was a part of your
I mean, I haven't been able to read fiction the last 2 or 3 years, and I miss it. I think I need to get back to it. So
read the newspaper.
All right, let's close with a prayer. All right, on that we'll go. So, dear God, we do ask that you will always give us reasons for hope and focus our faith in such a way that faith and hope, almost by their very nature, become the same thing, because it's the author and giver of both. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. You can cut us off now, I guess. Thank you all.
It's always good to see you. I'm glad you're coming.